So when did change become so rapid that we can no longer say we are still in the agrarian era? We asked this question of the medieval Malthusian cycle that ran from 500 CE to 1350. And what we saw was that though we can see an increase in the significance of our three main drivers of growth, which are commerce, capitalism, and the expansion of exchange networks, the population crash at the end of the cycle confirms the impression that we've not yet left the agrarian age. Now we ask similar questions of the next large Malthusian cycle, which extends from about 1350, the era of the Black Death, to about 1700. And this I'll call the early modern Malthusian cycle. Let me first give you the population figures so you get a sense of the general shape of this Malthusian cycle. Once more, you might want to mentally upload a graph. And it's got the following dates. The first date is 1400. Remember, that's when the Aztecs are building their empire in central Mexico, and much of Eurasia is recovering from the Black Death. The next date is 1500. Just 8 years after Columbus's return from his first trip to the Americas. The next date is 1600. This is a very easy sequence. We're going century by century. 1600 is when figures such as Galileo are beginning to transform European science, while the Americas are beginning to recover from a demographic catastrophe far more severe than the Black Death. And the last date is 1700, which we take as a symbolic starting date for the modern era. So let me give you some population figures. Let's begin with Europe. European populations in 1400 were about 52 millions. 52 millions. In 1500, there were 67. In 1600, they were 89. And in 1700, they were 95. Now, you'll note we're not seeing a crash here. At most, we're seeing a sort of slowdown in growth in the late 17th century. And there is indeed evidence of a sort of minor dip in the 17th century, and in fact throughout much of Eurasia, but there's no real crash. Now, here are the equivalent figures for China. 70, 84, 110, and 150. And the figures for India are 74, 95, 145, and finally 175 million. Now, in the case of China, too, you can find evidence for a slowdown, certainly in the 17th century, but here we find no evidence of a crash at the end of this cycle. And this provides the first hint that global rates of productivity may have been beginning to keep pace with population growth better than ever before. So that's already an interesting sign that we may be on the verge of modernity. So did this cycle bring the world closer to modernity? Did rates of innovation begin to accelerate sharply? How rapidly did commerce and capitalism expand? Did the world become more interconnected? Now we'll see that the answers to these questions are slightly contradictory. First, the first and most spectacular change probably of all in this period was in exchange networks. And this has to count as one of the most spectacular changes in all of human history. What happens after the voyages of Columbus is that the four world zones are linked over the next 200 years for the first time in human history. And the creation of this first global exchange network stimulated commerce and capitalism. The linking of the four world zones counts, as I've said, as one of the great events of human history. Suddenly, it was a bit as if Pangaea had been recreated, as ideas, goods, crops, people, and also diseases began to circulate rapidly across the entire globe, as they never had before. We've seen before, history seemed to take place in four completely isolated domains. Now, for the first time, and this is the first step towards what we call globalization today, human history is taking place on a single integrated stage, much larger and more varied and more diverse than any of the stages on which it had taken place before. This weaving together of the four world zones was the work of European mariners using highly maneuverable ships equipped with cannon, and they were backed by aggressive, commercially minded governments. Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic and headed back in 1492. The first captain known to have circumnavigated the globe was Juan Sebastián del Cano. He was a commander in the fleet of Ferdinand Magellan, and he returned to Spain with the remnants of the fleet in 1522. Magellan's fleet travelled around South America, around Cape Horn, then across the Pacific to the Philippines. And it was here in the Philippines that its commander, Ferdinand Magellan, was killed on the island of Cebu in battle with a local chief called Lapu-Lapu. Now, after these voyages, for the first time in history, the world is united. This sudden expansion of world markets stimulated commerce and capitalism very, very significantly. Even Karl Marx regarded this as a fundamental turning point in the history of capitalism. And that's why he writes, world trade and the world market date from the 16th century. And from then on, the modern history of capital starts to unfold. A lot of things happened. These exchanges were significant almost immediately in the 16th century. They took the form, or at least one form of these exchanges, was what the historian Alfred Crosby has called the Columbian Exchange, a massive exchange of goods and people and diseases between the Americas and the Afro-Eurasian zone. Here are some of the things that exchanged. American crops such as maize, potatoes, manioc and tomatoes were quite soon being grown in many parts of Eurasia, including China, Europe and Africa. And here they soon stimulated population growth because they could often be grown in regions that were unsuitable for local staples. So the effect of introducing these crops was to widen the area that could be farmed and to increase total output of food and other produce. Between 1400 and 1700, the populations of China, India and Europe all doubled. Increasing trade stimulated commerce and capitalism in most of the old hub regions of Eurasia. The Eastern Mediterranean, the Muslim world, northern India and in China. As China's population and economy expanded, it began to suck in silver for coinage. In the 16th century, Chinese governments began to demand that taxes be paid in silver. And this had a huge impact on the world economy. That, incidentally, is a measure of how huge the Chinese economy was and what a significant driver it was of world economic change. But this also benefited European middlemen who extracted the silver by force from American mines. Where did the silver come from? Well, much of it came from a single place, Potosi in modern Bolivia. The city was created when it was discovered, when Spanish colonists discovered that the region around Potosi included a virtual mountain of silver, and they discovered this in 1545. Within 30 years, Potosi had a population of 120,000. And it was certainly one of the larger cities in the world by then. In 1650, its population may have been 160,000. But after that, it began to decline with a decline in silver output. At its height, Potosi was a brutal and violent place. And Potosi illustrates very well some of the brutal sides of what I've called the Columbian Exchange. This was not a peaceful process. Indians were forced to labor in the mines and died in huge numbers from overwork, exposure, and brutal treatment, particularly children. But they also died from mercury poisoning. The silver ore extracted from Potosi was crushed, then it was mixed with mercury, after which workers were forced to tread it into a compound with mercury. The mixture of mercury and silver ore was then heated to drive off the mercury, leaving pure silver and deadly fumes. As locals died in huge numbers, they were often replaced with African slaves. This is not a pretty story. Increasing commercialization began to transform the lives of peasants in many areas. Now here's just an illustration from China. And I've gone back to Mark Elvin's book, The Pattern of the Chinese Past, for this quotation. And here's Elvin's account of how Chinese peasants were increasingly sucked into markets. And let me remind you that what's going on here is that people who had been peasants are slowly being transformed into wage earners. And that's a process that will continue and is continuing today in the early 21st century. Increased contact with the market, he writes, made the Chinese peasantry into a class of adaptable, rational, profit-oriented petty entrepreneurs. A wide range of new occupations opened up in the countryside. In the hills, timber was grown for the booming boat-building industry and for the construction of houses in the expanding cities. Vegetables and fruit were produced for urban consumption. All sorts of oils were pressed for cooking, lighting, waterproofing, and even to go in hair creams and medicines. Sugar was refined, crystallized, and used as a preservative. Fish were raised in ponds and reservoirs to the point where the rearing of newly hatched young fish for stock became a major business. Growing mulberry leaves for silk making did become a major business. Now, once again, I hope that what that passage does is illustrate the huge number of different ways in which peasants could find themselves slowly sucked into market activities and on the slippery slope of becoming eventually wage earners. The network of the emergence of a single global network of exchanges began to transform the global geography of wealth and power. And this is one of the major changes of this period. For most of the agrarian era we've seen, the Atlantic region was marginal to world history. In Afro-Eurasia, the major centres were in the Eastern Mediterranean, North India and China. In the American zone, they lay in Mesoamerica and the Andes. Suddenly, Europe now finds itself at the centre of the first global world system. And this is largely because of the role that European merchants and European mariners have played in weaving the four world zones together. European merchants not only pioneered the first transoceanic exchange networks, but they also managed to maintain control of them for several centuries. Europe itself is becoming more distinctive in this period. It's an odd world. A durable pattern emerges in Europe very different from that in China at the other end of Eurasia, not of large unified empires that encourage the patterns of tribute-taking of traditional tributary states, but something really rather different. In Europe, what you get is a durable pattern of small or medium-sized states that seem to be engaged in constant competition. This world ought to remind you slightly of the world of the Sung dynasty that I described in the last lectures. European rulers are ruling medium states. They don't have colossal resources available if they try to survive merely by exacting tributes from peasants. And yet they face constant warfare, a very, very competitive international political situation. So they have to seek commercial sources of revenue. And the result is that European rulers find themselves generally more supportive of commerce than the great empires of the Muslim world or China. Someone like Venice or Genoa is an archetype of a mercantile state, but many of the cities of Europe are sort of somewhere between the two. We have rulers whose attitudes very much look like those of traditional tributary rulers, but in fact they are becoming increasingly dependent on commercial revenues and increasingly supportive of commercial activity. With supportive governments and a central position in global commercial networks, European societies become increasingly capitalistic, and their governments become increasingly supportive of entrepreneurial activity, above all on the international stage, of which Europe now finds itself at the centre. In Britain, the slow transformations of society that go on as a result of this increasing commercial pressure are evident from the remarkable statistics assembled by Gregory King, who lived in the late 17th century. His dates are 1648 to 1712. Gregory King is a fascinating figure, and he's one of the pioneers of modern statistical studies. We're surrounded by statistics today. We often forget how recent this barrage of statistics is, and Gregory King is one of the crucial figures. He worked for many years in the College of Arms. It still exists. It was founded in the Middle Ages. And what it does is it keeps records of the coats of arms of British families. And it may have been this position that gave him access to a lot of important government information at the end of the 17th century. In 1696, King compiled a manuscript called Natural and Political Observations upon the State and Condition of England. In it, he estimated the population and wealth of England and Wales. He also offers statistics on demographic facts, such as the numbers of those in different classes, the numbers of people of different ages, the percentage of those who are married, and so on. As an aside, he also attempted to calculate the amount of beer drunk each year. King's statistics are a wonderful treasure trove for modern historians of 17th and 18th century Britain. And here are some of the things that come out of these statistics. According to King, in 1688, 43% of the British population consisted of, and I quote, cottagers and paupers, or of labouring people and out-servants. It may not be immediately obvious why this is so striking, but what King is really saying here is that almost half of Britain's population had no land and had to survive entirely from wage labour. Cottagers and paupers, labouring people and out-servants, these are not fully viable peasants who are supporting themselves from the land. These are people who might look like peasants, but they're really at the margins, and most of their income has to come from wage labour of some kind. Now that's very striking. If you remember our rule of thumb that, roughly speaking, 9 out of every 10 people in agrarian civilizations were probably peasants, here we have a society in which 40 to 50% seem to be wage earners of some type. Now, modern studies, many of them using some of King's statistics, suggest that in the late 17th century, more than half of British national income came from commercial activities of various kinds. By the early 18th century, most of the revenues of the British government came from commercial sources. And this ensured that the British government would aggressively back commerce. And the importance of commerce was evident also from the many merchants in the British Parliament of the 18th century. So here we have a society which in many ways still looked like a traditional tributary society. But if you start looking more closely at flows of wealth, sources of revenue, and so on, you find a society that is becoming increasingly commercialized, increasingly capitalistic. So at least in some areas of the world, we find capitalist social structures are becoming more dominant, commercial activity is spreading widely, and in the world as a whole, we've seen global networks have stimulated exchange and commerce on a huge scale. Now, if indeed these drivers, capitalism, commerce, expansion of exchange networks, are flourishing, are more and more visible in this era, shouldn't this be stimulating innovation? Shouldn't there be a sharp acceleration in global rates of innovation? Is there? Well, here the evidence really is ambiguous. There were significant improvements in shipping in this period and in military technology. This is, after all, the era of the gunpowder revolution. Also in mining and in instrument building of various kinds. And you could list a number of other fields. But in general, global rates of innovation appear to have remained fairly sluggish. Populations grew less because of significant innovations than because of other changes, such as, for example, the introduction of American crops, or government backing for the settlement of new lands, from Siberia to South America. In the early modern period, there's a mass of government activity designed to support migration to new areas. The Russians are supporting emigration to Siberia. The Chinese are supporting emigration to underpopulated regions of China. The Europeans are supporting emigration to the Americas. It may seem that the European scientific revolution is an exception. So we need to consider this. The European scientific revolution itself may well have been a product in part of the torrent of new information that flowed through European societies, as Europe found itself at the centre of the first global network of information. After all, think of the implications of this. Suddenly, Europe finds itself a sort of clearinghouse for information from around the world. No society in previous human history has actually had access to information from around the world, information about new cultures, different technologies, different religious beliefs, different types of people, different types of societies. And this is what's happening in Europe in the 16th and 17th century. Suddenly there's this torrent of new information, much of it completely unexpected. It's almost as if new planets had been discovered. What's the impact of this bound to be? Well, the main impact seems to have been to encourage European thinkers, philosophers, natural scientists, even theologians, to start questioning authority. So many of the things that traditional knowledge had said about the world have turned out to be wrong, that increasingly European natural philosophers find themselves saying, well, where's the evidence? And this is what Bacon says loud and clear. Where's the evidence? So this is the start of what we've seen throughout this course, this commitment to knowledge based not on authority, but evidence. So this is an immensely important transformation. Yet, the crucial thing is that as yet, and probably not until the 19th century, science had very little impact on technological innovation. Only in the 19th century, for the first time, do you start getting factories, for example, setting up labs to research innovation. So, for a surprisingly long period, science had a rather limited impact on technological innovation. Now let's look at the other world zones outside Afro-Eurasia. What was the impact of this global unification on them? And the short answer is it was catastrophic. We've seen that there are ways in which the Afro-Eurasian zone flourished as a result of this unification of the world. In other regions, the results were catastrophic. Why? Globalization exposed the other world zones to colonization and to brutal exploitation by European invaders. We've already had a look at the silver mines of Potosi in modern Bolivia as an example of this sort of exploitation. All of this designed to ensure flows of silver that eventually reached China and profit Europeans. But there's another crucial factor here, and that is disease. This is a pattern we've seen before in the era of agrarian civilizations. As exchange networks expand, disease vectors also start moving into new regions. And if diseases move into regions where there's no immunity, the results can be catastrophic. And this is what happened in the 16th century as a result of the coming together of the world zones. Europeans brought with them to the Americas and eventually to the Australasian zone and the Pacific diseases for which indigenous populations had no immunity at all. Smallpox was perhaps the most lethal of all of these. And smallpox appears in Central America within 15, 20 years of the arrival of Columbus. Why was this coming together so catastrophic in disease terms? Well, we've seen already in Afro-Eurasia, there were several reasons why immune systems over Afro-Eurasia should have become increasingly hardened. The widespread use of domesticated animals allowed diseases to cross species, creating a rich palette of diseases. Furthermore, we've seen trans-Eurasian exchange networks created multiple immunities in the major population zones of Afro-Eurasia. So by 1500, Afro-Eurasia as a whole, particularly its cities, are a zone in which people have immunities to a wide range of diseases. The other world zones had smaller populations, few or no domesticated animals, and much smaller exchange networks. And the result was a less rich disease environment and much more limited immunities. So, when Afro-Eurasian diseases such as smallpox are introduced, the results are catastrophic. And what they do is they mimic the impact of Eurasian plagues, but sometimes on a far larger scale. In the more densely settled regions of Mesoamerica and Peru, it's been estimated that populations may have fallen from 50 to 70%. This is a highly controversial area, but what there's no doubt about is that the population decline is very severe in the course of the 16th century. For indigenous Americans, this was an apocalyptic calamity. Here, just to illustrate this, is an account of what happened and what this meant, written from sources in the Yucatan Peninsula. Just one description of what this may have meant to indigenous Americans in the Yucatan, in the Maya area. Before the Europeans arrive, says this account, there was then no sickness. They had no aching bones. They had then no high fever. They had then no smallpox. They had then no burning chest. They had then no abdominal pain. They had then no consumption. They had then no headache. At that time, the course of humanity was orderly. The foreigners made it otherwise when they arrived here, and that's cited from Alfred Crosby's book on the Columbian Exchange. Here's another description of what happened, and it's from the other side of this disease holocaust. Written by Thomas Harriot, who was the surveyor from the English colony on Roanoke Island. Within a few days, he wrote, within a few days after our departure from every such town, people began to die very fast, and many in short space. In some towns about 20s, in some 40, in some 60, and in one 60, which in truth was very many in respect of their numbers. The diseases also were so strange that they neither knew what it was nor how to cure it. The like, by report of the oldest men in the country, never happened before, time out of mind. Okay, now can we summarize? How much had the world changed by 1700? There's no doubt that globalization had stimulated commerce and capitalism, particularly in the Afro-Eurasian zone, but also in many areas of the Americas, and eventually would do so in the other world zones of Australasia and the Pacific. The process has been particularly destructive, of course, in the Americas. So our drivers of growth are clearly flourishing in this era. Yet, in much of the world, states were still dominated by traditional tribute-taking elites with traditional aristocratic values, and that means attitudes that were fundamentally anti-commerce, opposed to the development of capitalistic activities. Peasants, though increasingly enmeshed in market exchanges, remained the vast majority of the population in most countries. So these traditional social structures, which still dominate much of the world, may explain why on a global scale innovation remained sluggish. We certainly don't yet see the spectacular rates of innovation characteristic of modernity. So in the early modern Malthusian cycle, though there are some areas, such as parts of Europe, where changes are beginning to look very decisive indeed, and though we've seen the downturn was nothing like as severe as in the medieval cycle, nevertheless, the basic structures of the agrarian era remained in place. And that may explain why rates of innovation remained low. So when did the breakthrough to modernity finally occur? Thank you. 10 and 150. And the figures for India are 74, 95, 145, and finally 175 million. Now, in the case of China too, you can find evidence for a slowdown, certainly in the 17th century, but here we find no evidence of a crash at the end of this cycle. And this provides the first hint that global rates of productivity may have been beginning to keep pace with population growth better than ever before. So that's already an interesting sign that we may be on the verge of modernity. So did this cycle bring the world closer to modernity? Did rates of innovation begin to accelerate sharply? Commerce, capitalism, and the expansion of exchange networks? The population crash at the end of the cycle confirms the impression that we've not yet left the agrarian age. Now we ask similar questions of the next large Malthusian cycle, which extends from about 1350, the era of the Black Death, to about 1700. And this I'll call the early modern Malthusian cycle. Let me first give you the population figures so you get a sense of the general shape of this Malthusian cycle. Once more, you might want to mentally upload a graph. And it's got the following dates. The first date is 1400. Remember, that's when the Aztecs are building their empire in central Mexico, and much of Eurasia is recovering from the Black Death. The next date is 1500, just 8 years after Columbus's return from his first trip to the Americas. The next date is 1600. This is a very easy sequence. We're going century by century. 1600 is when figures such as Galileo are beginning to transform European science, while the Americas are beginning to recover from a demographic catastrophe far more severe than the Black Death. And the last date is 1700, which we take as a symbolic starting date for the modern era. So let me give you some population figures. Let's begin with Europe. European populations in 1400 were about 52 millions. 52 millions. In 1500, there were 67. In 1600, they were 89. And in 1700, they were 95. Now, you'll note we're not seeing a crash here. At most, we're seeing a sort of slowdown in growth in the late 17th century. And there is indeed evidence of a sort of minor dip in the 17th century, and in fact throughout much of Eurasia, but there's no real crash. Now, here are the equivalent figures for China. 70, 84, 100. So when did change become so rapid that we can no longer say we are still in the agrarian era? We asked this question of the medieval Malthusian cycle that ran from 500 CE to 1350. And what we saw was that though we can see an increase in the significance of our three main drivers of growth, which are